Before we get into this tier list slash Call of Duty ranking, there's a bit of clarification that needs to get out of the way. Firstly, any console exclusive game outside of Call of Duty 3, since it's a mainline entry, is excluded. So this means, unlike a lot of other people's lists, that I'm actually covering the first 3 games, as well as United Offensive, the expansion pack for the original Call of Duty, but not console exclusive spin-offs like Call of Duty 2 Big Red One. Secondly, where I'm placing these games on this tier list is in comparison to each other, not first-person shooters in general. My favourite Call of Duty game, which we'll get to, will be at the S tier, and that will serve as a benchmark for the rest. Age is irrelevant to me, so it plays no part in my ranking. No special credit will be given just because the game's over a decade old. This is purely comparing my enjoyment of each game to one another. Thirdly, I've finished all of these games on Veteran, so if a game was overly easy or overly frustratingly difficult, that may or may not be taken under consideration, but I'll explain my reasoning anyway. Fourthly, I'm sort of half reviewing these games as I go in a summary form, so if you don't want to hear me ramble about a game you have no interest in for 50 minutes, then feel free to check the timestamps in the description to skip ahead. Lastly, I have no nostalgic connections to any of these games. I've never really stopped playing the ones I first played when I was younger, around 11 years old at the very youngest. I'm 19 now, and I still don't really think I was old enough to hold such nostalgic feelings, so yeah. Anyway, let's kick things off, starting with the original Call of Duty. The original Call of Duty is a unique entry in the series, not just for being the first in the series, but more infamously due to its lack of regenerating health. This, along with the complete removal of health packs on Veteran, makes the game very challenging, even if you can quick save on PC, unlike most Call of Duty games. This actually results in really unique gameplay, not just for the series, but FPS games as a whole, as I sometimes found myself crawling to objectives on my hands and knees and leaning around every corner fearing for my life, as every shot would have serious repercussions. Limiting myself to only using checkpoints only instead of save scumming, as I'm guilty of doing, really happened in this feeling of being a vulnerable little twat eating dirt just to keep his scalp intact. The original Call of Duty builds upon its spiritual predecessor Medal of Honor Allied Assault with more polish, smoother movement in combat, and better graphics. Honestly, it still looks respectable at points. Set it to 4K and the game's not offensive visually. Dated, even for 2003, yeah, ever so slightly, but good art design holds up, and some of the set pieces are still really impressive. It's no wonder why this game was so praised on release. I especially love the Russian levels in this game, and the fact that in the old school CODs prior to Modern Warfare, but even more so in this than COD 2 and 3, you could actually hipfire with any sort of accuracy. I actually found myself hipfiring more than scoping or using iron sights. I get why that changed for future installments, but for me it makes the combat feel a little smoother, as I'm used to old school FPS games where iron sights didn't exist. And I also like the almost complete absence of weapon sway when zooming in. I can also appreciate that your friendly AI aren't totally useless in this game and can actually get a solid amount of kills for themselves. Now, it's not an overly memorable game, and I don't mean to come off like an elitist, but if you're not going to play it on Veteran, I wouldn't hate you for skipping this, just because it's not too dissimilar to Call of Duty 2 otherwise, but simply due to the health system and how punishingly difficult this game is anyway, it really makes for a hell of an experience where your reaction times and usage of the prone button really comes into play. There are a few greater feelings than hitting a checkpoint in the original Call of Duty, and that feeling simply lost when playing on easier difficulties or when quick saving your way through it. For this reason and many others, 2003's Call of Duty debut deserves a spot at the higher echelon of the B tier. Again, it's not overly memorable and there's very little in the way of story, but it's easy to get running with very few compatibility problems and is certainly a worthwhile experience if you've got the time and money. By the way, this game's available on the Xbox 360 and Xbox One, and I assume the PS3, as Call of Duty Classic, but honestly, unless you just really prefer using a controller or playing on the couch, which is fair, I definitely recommend getting this on PC instead. Imagine this game would be much more challenging than it already is without the quick reaction times a mouse and keyboard can allow. And I imagine absolutely everything can run it nowadays, if not at 4K even. The expansion pack for the original Call of Duty is a really respectably lengthed game, clocking in at the same average completion time as the latest full Call of Duty game according to the website How Long to Beat. Yeesh. So I don't even feel as if it's at an inherent disadvantage by its nature as an expansion pack. Regardless, United Offensive is the largest scale take in the original with an even higher difficulty and level of intensity. There are fewer close quarters areas than the first game and the pacing's a bit better, and I do feel as though the level design is much more enjoyable in this one. It feels a bit more realistic and less action movie in its scenarios in comparison to the original game, with you defending against waves and pushing through heavy infantry with more moments of holy shit, there are bullets whizzing all around me, and if I lift my head for a second I'll probably get a nice hole in it. The improvements in level design aren't enough to make this an S tier Call of Duty, but geez, it's not far off. This lowly expansion pack is actually really enjoyable, no matter how bloody brutal it is. Rarely are expansion packs much better than their main games, but this certainly is, and it may be one of the best I've ever played. Although if I ever have to play that final mission again on Veteran, I'll probably shoot myself in the head. A tier. Call of Duty 2 is intense, but not for the same reasons as its predecessors, or even its best successors. COD 2 puts you in scenarios where you feel like just another soldier on the battlefield against insurmountable odds, and it does this better than any other game I've played, outside of the vulnerability of the player in the first Call of Duty. But in this it stems from its larger scale conflicts and truly bombastic battles. Whereas the original felt like you partook in large skirmishes or had you single-handedly infiltrating Nazi-occupied dams to blow up anti-air cannons like you're fucking James Bond, Call of Duty 2 feels like you're right on the front lines more often than not, although it does have its fair share of smaller scale firefights. Again, Call of Duty 2 is actually quite a unique experience if you're playing on a difficulty that will challenge you. I'm not saying you have to play on Veteran for this one, but it'll simply be a different experience if you don't feel like you're getting pushed to the limit on your difficulty level of choice. But yeah, mate, I love COD 2. It's a bit more refined than the original and does hold up better. Production values are higher with better animations, textures and set pieces. Music's also pretty solid, even better than the first games, which also had some great tracks. It also just has a feel to it that I really like. I couldn't even tell you why, but to me it just has a really cool atmosphere to it, especially on the Russian levels. It's also quite a long game, it has satisfying combat, and it's just a bloody blast. But while I do easily prefer it to the original game, I do have some minor issues with it. I find that the hitboxes are really crap in this for the enemies, which I've never had issues with in the first game. Weapons are just generally less satisfying for some reason I can't quite put my finger on, and a few other mild things. The level design is generally much more to my taste in comparison to the first games. And admittedly, I do miss the health bar. Yes, it was artificially difficult in a sense, by taking away any opportunity to regain health within levels, on Veteran at least, in the first game, but that never bothered me as levels weren't all that long anyway. And while this again is intense in a different way, more due to overwhelming odds and shitty situations, I love the vulnerability of the first game, where every hit you took really mattered, and that is missing in this. My only real complaint that isn't just a mild niggle is that the game is on the easy side. Well, I'd finished this twice before my last playthrough for this video, but only once on Veteran, and I remember it being very difficult, but I have to say I was disappointed this time as I found it to be the easiest game prior to Modern Warfare 2 by a long shot, which I was surprised by. But even with all that said, I just, again, really prefer the level design in this, and it does have a different style of gameplay to the original that helps differentiate it, largely due to the regenerating health. It often feels like the first game turned up to 11, and for that reason, along with most of all that made the original game so good, as well as improvements in other key areas, this is an S tier game for me, and it is my second favourite game in the series, even despite its minor issues. I just think the level design and combat are both stellar. It's full of memorable missions, enjoyable weapons, and I've always really enjoyed the World War II theme, as well as the slightly more understated feel of these older COD games. But hell, if all of the levels were as good as the Russian ones, this would be my favourite in the series. But don't get me wrong, this is still a really consistent game, with no bad or even weak levels in the entire campaign. Call of Duty 3 is a console exclusive COD that I imagine a lot of people haven't gone around playing, given that it didn't do much to distinguish itself from the previous games. It does have some gameplay additions, there are a few cool driving sections with solid physics, some quick time events before I remember quick time events really being a thing, but it's probably the least consequential COD game, even if it does mark Treyarch's Call of Duty debut. I had a lot of fun with this, but man, it is brutal. Checkpoints can be scarce and cruel, which doesn't help when you often get stuck in the environment, shot through objects, and can't hit enemies due to crappy hitboxes. Seriously, this game has the worst hitboxes I've ever seen in a game. Well, less hitboxes and more the environment somehow blocking large chunks of the enemy's bodies that are in plain sight, and it happens a lot. Also, friendlies constantly get in your way, whether they're pushing you around or standing in front of your crosshairs, and it makes me want to break my controller. The infinitely respawning enemies at some sections can be bloody annoying too. This is probably the hardest Call of Duty on Veteran, and if you manage to finish it, you need to give yourself a nice, long, happy ending just to relieve all the stress of having to redo incredibly difficult sections. It's very frustrating a lot of the time. It's also not the greatest looking game in the world. It's quite muddy looking as opposed to the previous game's more natural but somewhat vibrant art styles. The newly implemented ragdoll is pretty goofy and doesn't even activate a lot of the time, and some of the first person reload animations are quite weak. But as I said, even though I'm deciding to put this in the C tier, mostly due to its minimal story, lack of innovation and unique identity, as well as its rather unpolished nature, if you've got an Xbox One or Series X, I do recommend giving this a shot. It's a solid, if not overly memorable and rushed release. Yeah, and I prefer playing my Call of Duties with a mouse and keyboard, so having to play with a controller at 720p isn't ideal, but it's still pretty smooth and snappy, so it's not a big deal. Even if the auto aim is a bit strong for my liking, making shooting overly simple. I do really like this game, but again, it's frustrating and feels more like Call of Duty 2.5 rather than Call of Duty 3. We all know the story. One day in sunny 2007, Modern Warfare hits the shelves and revolutionises the first-person shooter genre. The story's true. The multiplayer was addictive as fuck and highly innovative, setting the benchmark for many multiplayer FPS systems and styles of progression, but we're talking story here, and it similarly is held in very high regard. There's a reason COD 4 tops so many best of lists. It really is a highlight of the series. The set pieces are astonishingly well done, the characters are really likeable with memorable dialogue, missions are brilliant and diverse, and the shift to a relatable modern world was one that would have a profound impact on the industry, kickstarting the trend of modern military shooters for better or worse. There are so many iconic moments in this game. I remember watching my dad play this when I was younger and seeing the whole non-playable section where your character's executed, as well as the whole stealth ghillie suit stuff was just mind-boggling, and it still is a hell of a lot of fun today. There's no such thing as a truly bad Call of Duty game to me, and I do like others more than this, but even still I see why this game hasn't been surpassed for many, and I think it will be held as a classic for many more years to come. If there's one Call of Duty game to play, it's this. That being said, why I'm not putting this in the S tier is that it's a bit up and down in level quality. Most Call of Duty games are pretty consistent in quality after the first act, but while there's certainly no bad missions in this game, there are definitely some better than others. I know, everyone's going to be disappointed in me for not putting an S like everybody else, but that's how I feel. Call of Duty 4 gets shoved into a very respectable A. I actually reviewed World at War in full on this channel last year or the year before, and I quite enjoyed it. It's certainly a bloodier, darker and grittier game than the original World War II centered CODs, which makes it a very different experience to those games. There's heavy gore in this game that you won't find in almost any of the others, and certainly not from the prior games in the series, which is part of why this game has some of my favourite gunplay in the series. It's faster and more varied in gameplay scenarios than the original trilogy too, but the difficulty is more bullshit. This game's famous for enemy grenade spam on Veteran, and it's no exaggeration, it is absolutely absurd. The last few levels in particular can be quite frustrating, but generally the last third of this game is still some of the best Call of Duty can offer, even despite the obnoxious overuse of these little bastards. Story-wise, it's a bit light and not as well done as later games in the series, and there are a few levels that aren't all that great, but much more often than not this game's every bit as good as the originals, except with a darker tone and more modern feeling approach to level design with tighter environments and more set pieces. It's also one of two games that I know of in the entire series with a cooperable campaign, and it's great, with a cool scoring system and a dozen different types of gameplay modifiers. With all that being said, I simply prefer the level design of the classics a lot of the time, especially COD 2, and the often artificial difficulty can get tiring quickly, but the characters, soundtrack, graphics and overall atmosphere of this game are all highlights of the series, even despite the frustration that comes with playing this thing on Veteran. It also has perhaps the best soundtrack in the series, which is almost enough to make up for the fact that it's definitely one of the toughest games in the series too.
Okay, good. So you got your sidearm. Alright, try switching to your rifle.
Modern Warfare 2 is where the amps went up to 11. The set pieces are the best in the series without a doubt, with many unforgettable moments. The levels are consistently superb start to finish. The arsenal is my favourite in the series, the soundtrack's mostly pretty good, the villain is brilliant, and even the graphics hold up pretty well whether you get the original or the remaster. I really do think this is the best COD. It echoes back to Call of Duty at times with its wave defense sections against large groups of enemies, but with more modern production values, while also having much of the close quarters insurgent type gameplay of next year's Black Ops and moments of COD 4, but with the best gunplay in the series in my opinion. Its epic and bombastic feel won't appeal to everyone, but for me it honestly blew me away when playing for the first time, and while I'm not taking this into account on this tier list, I've rarely had gaming experiences as fun as co-op Spec Ops, and for me it's easily the best addition to this series, so it just has to be mentioned. If anything is worth calling epic, it's this. Obviously for me this is an S tier Call of Duty, and even if we were taking all game modes into account, this would be without a doubt my favourite Call of Duty. It's just superb.
Think about what you have to lose.
While the story typically has its share of stupid moments, it's easily one of the best in the series. The whole theme of brainwashing, conspiracies, hallucinations, interrogation, and all of its unexpected connections to World at War really fucks with me. It's also the last COD to actually be, challenging. From the next game and on, with few exceptions, Veteran becomes a breeze. But yeah, this game's quite dark with a surprisingly thick atmosphere, memorable characters and missions, and great voice acting, and also a really solid soundtrack. Even things like the Arsenal is one of the best in the series, and it's still got that impactful gore from World at War, even if it has been toned down a slight bit. This is surely one of the more memorable campaigns in the series, and while it's not perfect and I do just generally prefer the gameplay and set pieces of the first two Modern Warfare games, nevertheless this is still a terrific game that I recommend to anyone who enjoys military first person shooters. Yet another A tier game for me. Modern Warfare 3 kind of feels like more Modern Warfare 2 but much less impressive. It's bigger but it's less impactful. Most of these missions are really forgettable stuff. It certainly has its moments, but mate, I don't even know what to say about it. I finished this game last year as opposed to this year like the rest, besides the Modern Warfare reboot and Ghosts, but I've already forgotten a lot of it. The stuff I remember doesn't stand out to me in any real way, as being worth mentioning. It's just more Modern Warfare 2.5 than Modern Warfare 3. It rarely has you on the edge of your seat, it rarely does anything different gameplay wise, and it starts off pretty wimpily too. It's pretty average, but still fun. I like the characters to an extent, I love the gameplay, and yeah, it's a solid game, but not as good as it should have been. I skimmed through a walkthrough on YouTube to remind myself, because even I'm wondering what about this is so bad that makes it worth being put in the C tier when I put its predecessor in the S tier, but it's hard because there's nothing really overly offensive about this game in any regard. Well, I guess on one hand there is, by it just being so by the numbers. With MW2, almost every mission stands out in my mind. Looking at gameplay of each mission in this, I remember them all perfectly well now that I've seen them again, but there are very few positive impressions left in my mind. Look, it's really hard to explain why I don't care for this game that much when it's so similar gameplay wise to a game I love, but the great thing about an opinion is that you don't need to provide factual evidence to support it, because it's purely subjective. So sorry I can't give you a good answer as to why this is so low on my list, but it is. Modern Warfare 3, pretty forgettable. And if there's any game on the list outside of MW2 that I should have nostalgia for, it's this. It's the one game besides the Modern Warfare reboot that I bought on launch with my mates when the hype was unreal, so I have very fond memories of playing it for the first time. But unlike Modern Warfare 2, playing it twice since 2011 hasn't confirmed any love for the game's campaign. It's really only worth playing to conclude the trilogy. It has to be said, the story in Black Ops 2 is really fucking stupid. Look, I enjoyed Black Ops 2, there's no doubt about it, and it's one of the only truly innovative and unique Call of Duty since COD 4, and that's why I do certainly have an appreciation for it. The loadout system was great, the actions have consequences concept was really cool, the alternating timelines and weaponry was brilliant, the new enemy types added variety to gameplay, the music was fantastic, and for whatever reason I really liked Harper as a character, I thought he was awesome. Where this game went wrong, however, is in its story. I'm not one to analyse a narrative and spot plot holes, but the amount of absurdity, stupidity, and far-fetched nonsense is too much even for me. Don't get me wrong, the story in this is intriguing, but even for Call of Duty, it's a special level of dumb. It's also a sequel that never needed to be made in my opinion. The original Black Ops stood really well by itself, well, along with World at War, and concluded nicely. This doesn't follow the whole brainwashing conspiratorial theme of that game, but it does make good use of its characters, I have to say, which I really can't for its sequels. The whole Strike Force missions were cool in concept and even fun in execution, but they certainly could have been expanded upon and refined. Also worth noting is that for 2012 this game looks dated, especially early on. I mean, compare this to its peers and it looks positively ancient at times. But anyway, this is still a solid game. It's just a shame that the story is so painfully dumb and that the game's one of the easiest in the series, almost totally devoid of challenge. B tier. I finished this last year and I didn't remember it well when initially writing this, as I haven't been bothered to replay it. But as I did with Modern Warfare 3, I looked at every mission to remind myself, and again it's all clear as day now that I've seen it again, but as with MW3, the impressions that have left are minimal. The gameplay is similar to Modern Warfare. The graphics aren't overly impressive but are a big improvement upon Black Ops 2's. The story is forgettable, but the moments I do remember are pretty cool, as the game does have enjoyable moments here and there. But by 2013, Call of Duty was getting stale, and this game has been rightfully bagged since announcement. It's not bad, again I certainly had fun, more than some later installments, but it is one of the most forgettable Call of Duty experiences, largely due to how little it gets wrong, but also how little it gets right in any noticeable way. Although, I do remember some of the last levels were pretty good. This is a C tier Call of Duty for me. Not even Kevin Spacey can save this one, and yes, Spacey is a fantastic actor, even if that doesn't excuse his shittiness as a person. The exosuit stuff is really underutilized outside of scripted moments. I barely used it, and that's partly because the game's already so easy, but also because when I did, I just felt like a waste of time. Why dodge? There's no projectiles to dodge, you either get hit or you don't, which is why it's best to sit in cover most of the time. It's not even like you're swarmed with grenades to avoid like World at War or something. Why double jump? There's not all that much verticality in the level design. Why riot shield when you can just shoot the enemies and regenerate normally by sitting behind the abundance of cover? Why use adrenaline when enemies still hit you with the same accuracy, and there's no use in slowing down gameplay since enemies are already easy to hit as they barely move? All of these things are just useless to me. The actually useful upgrades were too few and didn't mix gameplay up, and some upgrades were outright useless. Characters were uninteresting, gameplay was too familiar, the graphics already looked pretty dated with a gross colour palette and a generic sci-fi art style, the campaign's short, the story's cliched, and there are very few memorable missions, if any. And yeah, this is a very forgettable game. Is it fun? Yeah, just like all CODs, because they're always polished and refined games who stick to much of the same smooth combat formula since the original. But in comparison to the rest, this is a weak game. D tier.
There, that bed, dead ahead.
Black Ops 3 is certainly one of the strangest games in the series, and one of the most unique, along with its predecessor. It's also pretty fucking brutal, which again isn't too dissimilar to Black Ops 2, but even more so in this. It's a sequel to Black Ops 2, but more in its dark tone rather than it having any correlation story-wise to the previous Black Ops games. Black Ops 2 certainly introduced a more sci-fi take on Call of Duty for the first time, and Advanced Warfare built on that a bit, but Black Ops 3 goes all out with robo-arms, robots, an assortment of powers at your disposal, literal mind control, and forceful memory hijacking. It's too far out for my taste and isn't overly original with its setting and science fiction concepts, but it does allow for some seriously pretty visuals in these pseudo-cyberpunk, dilapidated city landscapes. Black Ops 3 seems to get shit on the most out of all COD campaigns, maybe second behind Ghosts, and I honestly can't see why. The story is interesting and different for Call of Duty with its own strong atmosphere. The soundtrack is, yet again for the Black Ops series, really solid. The graphics are a big improvement upon Advanced Warfare, and the gameplay is perhaps the smoothest and fastest in the entire series. It also adds a bunch of new gameplay elements such as further loadout customization, even being able to change during levels, the aforementioned powers or abilities which you can unlock and upgrade, which are mostly pretty cool, wall running, a little safe house in between missions that allows you to change your outfit for your more prominently featured protagonist, make weapon blueprints, do these awesome combat simulations, and so on. If you're used to other COD games, it may be a bit to take in at first, but pretty quickly you'll get the hang of it all. And almost all of the side content, if not all of it, is completely avoidable if you don't give a toss. Hell, you can even unlock all campaign missions from the start if you really want. Also worth mentioning is that the campaign can be finished in co-op for the first time since World at War, and the last time since. One of the things I really dislike about this game, or at least on my first playthrough, is the almost complete absence of challenge on veteran, but there is the bonus masochistic difficulty realism, so I assume that'll fix my issues with that. My biggest issue with this game is just how little there is to the combat. Yeah, it's frantic, satisfying, and overall just really enjoyable, but even with the new movement and abilities, or maybe even because of it, everything amounts to pump it full of lead with your primary or a rocket until it's dead. There's rarely any variety, and as I mentioned, there's minimal challenge, at least on veteran anyway. This is put into focus most when, for story reasons, you're put into a World War II environment where you face against the same type of foes as in the original World War II games. You know, MG nests, snipers, half-tracks, the typical stuff. But you're so fast and powerful that you just blast through it all without a care in the world. Cover is barely a necessity, nor the need for smokes, grenades, or swapping weapons, and everything has the same level of danger as everything else, basically, which is to say, very little. As a result, I found myself completely tuning out much more than any other game in the series. Look, Call of Duty's not Rainbow Six, and it doesn't need to be. But even for COD, this game feels pretty brainless gameplay-wise. There was always an element of strategy required, just like almost all FPS games on their hardest difficulties, but it feels almost entirely missing here. It is worth mentioning too that enemy types are also disappointing. AI seems much dumber overall than other games in the series, but all infantry die in very few hits. The only real difference in enemy types is that one takes way more hits than the others and walks slow, and another flies. There are a few more near the end of the game, but it feels a bit too late for all of that. And so for most of the game, you're kind of just facing against very similar enemies who don't really require any tactical precision, for lack of a better word. So, the game's flawed, but I find the story pretty interesting. I wouldn't exactly call it riveting, and it did lose me at points, but I certainly enjoyed it. The level design in this game is pretty good too, with almost every level being consistently good and varied visually. Combat is really smooth and fast, and graphically the game's gorgeous. It does a lot of new things for the series, and while I don't think this is some staple of the first-person shooter genre, not by any stretch, it is a really solid game, even if its gameplay and story won't blow you away. I do have a lot to criticise about this game, but regardless, for me, this is one for the B tier, and although it never really reaches the heights it seems to grasp at, it's still a much better game than Black Ops 2 in my opinion. This game certainly defied all my expectations. I heard some of the praise for its campaign, but I still saw a fair amount of dismission for it too. So I went in with higher than normal hopes and yeah, they were demolished. In the best possible way. It has to be said, the combat in this, some of the best in the series. Gunplay is really satisfying thanks to much better sounding guns than in previous games, even despite the addition of energy weapons and all kinds of sci-fi weaponry. But the way human enemies' armor pops off as they take hits with great audio feedback, along with bots how they crumble apart and blow up, just makes every hit of your weapons feel so much more powerful and effective than in previous games. Even if, generally, I'd say enemies can take a few more hits than in other games. And stuff like Seekerbot and being able to hack robots only to make them self-destruct in groups of enemies never gets old. I also love the enemy chatter. It reminds me of something from Fear, but a bit more understated. It's a small thing, but it's cool. And really, there are just a lot of small things, and big things, but in minor details and additions that help combat feedback or just generally change things up in really welcome ways. It also echoes the Modern Warfare games with the weapon recoil patterns, although toned down a bit. There's enough of it to greatly differentiate weapons, but it hasn't been reduced to the extent of the last two Black Ops games, where it's only just noticeable enough to warrant inclusion gameplay wise. This results in smoother and faster gunplay, but not overboard like Black Ops 3. Movement is smooth and responsive. Guns are different from one another, but similarly all enjoyable to use. Characters are really likeable in this and show both development and backstory through both text and dialogue, and there's a pacing to this game that really helps to separate it from the others in the series, even despite all the other huge changes. There's actual downtime in this, as you revisit your ship and have the opportunity to watch newscasts, read shit and customise your loadout, but you can also run by all that stuff if you couldn't care less. The ship-to-ship combat is frequent, but not enough to be annoying, and it is really well done. It's not as good as, say, the ship section of Halo Reach's Long Night of Solace mission, or, you know, dedicated flight games, but it's fast, controls well, and there's progression as you unlock all kinds of upgrades for your ship, although I do wish this was expanded upon. They also only standards the introduction or conclusions to levels rather than the main chunks, and even on the side missions that are solely ship-to-ship combat sequences, they're much shorter than the others, but it's still fun enough to be worth playing. Same goes for the outer space, low gravity infantry bits, but these are even shorter. I think Infinity Ward realised they weren't very fun, which they're not, as the movement isn't perfect, and hit-scan weaponry and slow imprecise movement with rare cover aren't an ideal combination, and so they purposefully kept them really short whenever they appear. Although that being said, they're really not that bad. They are good enough to warrant inclusion, I'm just glad they were kept to a minimum. This game also has moments of stealth, usually the pseudo-stealth type where it's more about getting the upper hand rather than full invisible infiltration, and even this is pretty well done. It's not complex and it is linear, but there is some minor challenge and satisfaction out of doing it, which did strike me as a mild change from stealth sections in the other games in the series. They're also usually not mandatory. And yes, Infinite Warfare has side missions. If you've played Black Ops Cold War but not this, given that this game unfairly sold about half of the year's previous COD title, Black Ops 3, so I don't expect many to have played this game, then you may be familiar with the concept of side missions. But no, this isn't some half-assed last-minute addition that lasts about 2 seconds. These are really solid, well-designed and engaging little missions that really aren't all that little for what they are. They're actually fairly long for what you might expect. And again, there's no drop in quality from the main missions either, despite being completely optional. Besides just the joy of playing these brilliant levels, they also give you achievements and, more importantly, upgrades for both your weapon, character and ship for playing them. So while there are a few less main missions than other games in the series, even those are pretty long, and these side missions more than make up for it. This is a really fucking cool addition and I love them. Anyway, this game really has kind of just startled me in how bloody good it is. I did not see it coming, so I'm sorry if I'm hyping this up like it's the second coming of Christ, but really, I urge any first person shooter fan to give it a shot. I don't care about your opinion on Call of Duty as a whole, or military shooters, or sci-fi shooters, whatever. If you like shooters, try it. Full stop. My only complaints with this game are how black and white both factions are. The evil guys are so obviously and unabashedly evil that they belong in a cartoon rather than anything meant for an adult audience. The protagonist is also a bit generic and underdeveloped, with no real defining features or interesting dialogue, although he's still likable to an extent, and for the first time in the series you get to play as a leader, a captain in fact, rather than a lower ranking soldier who follows everyone else around. Now I'm not sure if I like this game as much as Modern Warfare 2, I mean they're so different it's hard to even compare, but man, it's close whether it beats it or not. Both are fantastic games and I feel as though I could swap saying which is my favourite on the fly, but regardless, and as I'm sure you could predict, this is an S tier Call of Duty for me. Fuck it, this is an S tier first person shooter for me. And it's criminal that it gets so often overlooked. You like first-person shooters but haven't played this? You're going to jail.
Lieutenant Porter, we need tank support
The
now!
tanks are covering our
Everybody
flank!
pipe down and let me think, goddammit! We don't have time to think!
You know, while playing this and thinking of what rank I was going to give it, there were a lot of moments where I was like, yeah, this could be a B. But no, overall this is a C tier Call of Duty. There's too much bad, or rather, dull and uninteresting along with the good. For all of its glitz, glamour, modern and ultra high production values, I have to say that I just prefer the original World War II games. There's a simplicity to their presentation that I prefer, even if this game does look very pretty overall. It also gives some painful insight into how little, ultimately, the Call of Duty formula has changed over the years. Playing this and the original side by side is far from jarring. The original more than holds a candle, and while the gunplay is a bit more realistic in this, with substantial recoil, weapon sway and the like, I have to say that I prefer the more arcadey approach of the original games. I don't really know why I'm comparing this to the original so much, because it does certainly feel like a new school Call of Duty, but its World War II setting just makes it the natural comparison, and puts some things into perspective. But this is all purely subjective, as with mostly everything on this list by the way. Obviously on the storytelling front it's a large step up. Not that any of the pre-Call of Duty 4 Modern Warfare games were even trying to be story-driven games in the first place, because they weren't, and therefore you can't objectively fault them for that. But the facial animations, the voice acting, and the characters are all really well done, likeable, and interesting here. They're far less one-dimensional than in the vast majority of COD games and feel more human, being that we're all just really gifted shooters trying to get back home, rather than hardcore special ops kids saving the world. The lack of regenerating health is obviously the biggest change in gameplay here, but it doesn't really make all that much of a difference given that medkits are at your disposal at the press of a button, unlike in the original game where you either had no way of regenerating health or had to go around and find medkits that increased your health upon pickup. In this way, it's actually not all that dissimilar to regenerating health, except that it's manual, that ultra low health can mean a quick death, and that in rare occasions you won't be able to regenerate. It doesn't really force you to go out and scour the environment for health, especially given that you can just ask a squad member for a kit most of the time. It's a shame ammo isn't even remotely an issue here either, as it could have led to some more tense firefights where shots and picking up lesser weapons on the battlefield mattered that bit more. But as it is, it makes the guy who can give you ammo once the bar's full rather useless, because there's plenty of ammo everywhere, including boxes that completely restore it for any weapon. Anyway, while I do enjoy this game, it doesn't do enough to distinguish itself gameplay wise, with tight, linear environments and enemies that take too many hits to put down. And while the writing and narrative feels mostly very different to other Call of Duties, that's not quite enough to make it stand out. It doesn't pull any emotional punches until the end, as it acknowledges the atrocities of the war beyond the thrill of the violence, but even that could have been handled better, and the story does have its share of cliches, undoubtedly. Many missions are unspectacular, and this has some of my least favourite gunplay in the series. Again, don't get me wrong, this is far from a bad game, but I'm disappointed I didn't like it more. I can only give this one a C. Obviously Black Ops 4 doesn't have a campaign, so it can fuck off. I have to admit, this game had a bit of an effect on me. Look, certain things impact people more or less than others, so if you weren't convinced by the more mature, realistic and dark feel of this game, then I can't blame you. But likewise, you can't blame me for having felt like I was punched in the gut the first time I played this game. It's dark, but in a totally different way to previous games in the series like World at War for example. This feels like it hits close to home. It's more relatable than the distant setting of the 1940s, and the approach to its dark subject matter I think was handled really well, considering this game still has its share of very COD-like moments of over-the-top action and set pieces. Look, I'm not going to go into the finer elements too much. I really do think this is a unique entry in the series, if not the genre, and I do urge everyone who can stomach it to give it a shot. This is S tier for me, more for the story and subject matter than the gameplay, although that is still terrific, along with satisfying weaponry, very pretty visuals on an entirely new engine, and brilliant audio with firing sound effects that actually, for one of the first times in the series, have some serious punch to them. I really like this game, and I know plenty will disagree, and that's fine, but I personally think it delivered on its marketing. Finally, we have Black Ops Cold War, and this may be a bit controversial, although I'm not really sure what the general consensus is on the campaign. This is yet another sequel that in my eyes never needed to happen. Unlike Black Ops 3 though, this actually does have returning characters from Black Ops 1 and 2, but the question is why? It is so different in tone. In fact, I think it's the most kid-friendly game in the series since COD 3, even with its frequent peppering of the word fuck. There's very little in the way of blood for some reason. There's gasp humour in a COD game, even though it's coming from characters who were never funny in previous games, and the story is just crap. It's unoriginal, the characters are lame, and I was just not convinced by any of it. Mason, Woods and Hudson feel shoehorned in. Replace them with anyone else and it wouldn't have mattered, except you'd have even less attachment to all of these boring, inconsequential and underdeveloped side characters. The choices you make outside of the ending are ultimately irrelevant and inconsequential, unlike in Black Ops 2, and even though the game tries to do new stuff with an actual true stealth system and even optional missions, a whopping 2 of them at that, it all just feels so dated, and it's marred by its intense linearity throughout, even more so than a few other games in the series. I mean, all of these stealth sections feel like the most linear tutorial section of an actual stealth game out. It's like the first tutorial mission of Thief Deadly Shadows for all of them. It's really weak, really underdeveloped, and it's a poor substitute for real stealth gameplay that holds your hand way too much, barely improving on the very brief stealth bits featured in World War II. Outside of those sections, you've got uninspired, outright boring, and overly easy combat, some of the dumbest set pieces in a while, and yeah, this game's the weakest in the series so far for me. Every quote-unquote new idea is so ultimately shallow that they're really just not that enjoyable, and the hallucination stuff near the end was pretty lame. And I don't know why, but I really dislike Adler as a character. This is a D tier Call of Duty game, and I imagine I'll get some dislikes for this alone. Is it unenjoyable? No, overall it's not. I had some fun with this game, but none of its potential was met, and it did everything worse than almost every other entry in the series. I mean, even shooting doesn't feel as satisfying or rewarding as most games in the series, if any of them, and that's not an exaggeration. So in conclusion, I've had a blast, for the most part, going through the series again, especially playing through the first Call of Duty and its expansion pack. Those were definitely highlights for me, as well as the big surprise that was Infinite Warfare's holy presence. It was also great going through Modern Warfare 2 again, but with its remastered version this time, even if the remaster is a bit disappointing. But I had a hell of a time with it, and it confirmed my love for the game. It was fun going through the post-Ghosts games for the first time too, and revisiting a couple for the first time released beforehand like Black Ops 2 and Call of Duty 3, but I can't say I was left overly thrilled with many of the post-Black Ops 1 games outside of 2 of them. I honestly expected better, even despite the dismission of a lot of those games. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video. If I dissed a game you like, just remember it's only my opinion. I honestly think that these are all good games in their own right, so if you really like one that I don't like quite as much, I actually really can't blame you. Anyway, thank you for watching my last ever properly edited video. I had a good time making it, but let's face it, these videos are pretty crap anyway.